So, welcome everybody to today's event, The Other Virus Between Psychological and Geopolitical Effects of COVID-19. And thank you all for joining us. A special thank you to the psychology program and the Department of Anthropology, Psychology, and Sociology at University of West Georgia that made this event possible. I am Rossella Traversa, Assistant Professor of Psychology at University of West Georgia, and I am delighted to introduce today's discussion by saying just a few words about what brought us today to connect actually psychology and geopolitics. So the coronavirus sanitary crisis has strengthened the need to promote new ways to well-being, aging population, and sustainability worldwide, not only as a strictly medical phenomenon related to hospital and intensive therapy units, but conceptual reconfiguration of mortality and environment. Since the next pandemic seems to be not that far ahead, the body has been a crucial public arena, and physical and social environments shape the way our bodies have been affected by disease and how the disease has inhabited the body itself. But which bodies have been considered in need of protection during this COVID-19 pandemic? Which bodies have been considered less fragile? And who ultimately could be sacrificed? It is true that no one was really ready for this. It is also true that too many were not there on time when Italy needed help at the very beginning of this pandemic. This was the heartfelt apology that Ursula von der Leyen, the president of the European Commission, pronounced on April the 16th, 2020, during her speech at the European Parliament, with respect to the initial reaction of the EU member states to the upcoming coronavirus crisis. Such a statement, together with blocks of exports of ventilators and life-saving devices, even the free circulation of people among the EU member states, has been seen as the evidence of the lack of European cohesion in terms of healthcare system and social welfare. What has been even more vivid is that certain European countries like Hungary approved special authoritarian legislation to face the crisis, allegedly anti-democratic and against European values. COVID-19 crisis has progressively exposed the worldwide population to historical memories of mass vulnerabilities. The current pandemic has fueled the debate over human positioning on the earth, the lack of proper social welfare, and has reawakened the fear to not being able to handle the evergreen balance, work-life balance. The only way to be in relation with the so-called nature seems to be contactless. Moreover, the supposed universal biological phenomenon has shown how profoundly different are the approaches to diagnose, communicate, treat, and not least, detect the number of infected and deaths due to coronavirus. So which lives are worth a huge state effort to save them, and who, on the other hand, can be considered lost, do not appear as a global truth? Who and what is healthy, and who and what is threatening in viral terms did not appear as a natural tenet as well. The Global Burden of Disease 2016 injury collaborators and the Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation use considerable expertise and resources to provide a sweeping view of the magnitude of firearms deaths in 195 countries and territories across the globe. The study estimated that 251,000 firearm-related deaths occurred outside of state conflict settings in 2016, an increase from an estimated 209,000 firearm-related deaths in 1990. This constitutes another major public health problem for humanity. Several aspects of how these deaths were distributed are noteworthy. First, 64% of firearm-related deaths were homicides, 27% were suicides, and 9% were unintentional deaths. Second, in all but 1 year of the 27-year study period, with the exception of 1994, with the genocide in Rwanda, firearms deaths were more common outside war settings than within them. Such complex interconnection between power, nature, and the active role of human beings is being introduced in today's event about the other virus between psychological and geopolitical effects of COVID-19, promoted by the psychology program and the Department of Anthropology, Psychology, and Sociology at the University of West Georgia, in partnership with LIMES, the Italian Review of Geopolitics. So let me just give you a few words about our upcoming speakers and their review. So I want to thank and welcome Fabrizio Maronta, who is resident analyst and head of international relations at LIMES. Among his past positions, he taught political and economic geography at Università Roma III and joined the team defining Italy's negotiation position for the 2007-2013 EU budgetary period. He regularly reviews geopolitical issues, especially European and transatlantic ones, on different media outlets and seminaries. And then I want to thank and welcome Giorgio Cuscito, who is editorial board member since 2013. His analysis is focused on China, Indo-Pacific, and the Belt and Road Initiative. In 2017, he created the Imperial Bulletin, which is a LIMES weekly observatory on Belt and Road Initiative and the Indo-Pacific area. Since 2022, he's in charge of external relations for LIMES School of Geopolitics. And then a few words about LIMES. So LIMES, which comes from the later word for border, is the Italian Review of Geopolitics. It is a monthly journal published in Rome since 1993. The aim of LIMES is to analyze conflicts, political, cultural, or military ones, in specific spaces. Their analysis is based on maps, which represent the reasons and goals of the geopolitical actors involved in conflicts. So I would like to thank you all for joining us. And I would like to encourage you to type any question you might have already during our speakers talk in the chat down below, and I will take note of them. And afterwards, I will post them to our speakers. And we're gonna see during this webinar if we can just start with the Q&A question after the first speaker talk, or we can just collect all questions afterwards, just at the very end. So thank you once again, Fabrizio and Giorgio, and the stage is yours.
Thank you very much indeed, Rossella. Thank you to all of you for having us here today. I very much appreciate that you just came looking for us, actually, Rossella, after reading this issue, and which was the first one of this year. Conceived and written and printed maybe a geopolitical era before the one we entered in February 24 when Russia invaded Ukraine, which is something that you may watch on TV and hear of it and read of as one of the wars that unfortunately happen on this planet, but for us is something which is very close to, well, much closer to us than can be for others. And this itself testifies, if you want, to the relativity of space and let's say individual or collective, if we talk about state, perceptions of what happens daily in our geopolitical realm. This is something which applies to wars, wars like the one which is being fought in Ukraine right now, but also applies, at least for our perspective, to something such as the pandemics. You may remember then that one of the slogan, if you want to call it like that, or by the way of the catchphrases that were repeated, if you want, as a sort of self-fulfilling prophecy, or something of a karma which we repeated ourselves in order to give ourselves strength in those the very beginning of that mayhem, was that we are in this together, which is something that was very interesting to observe, was something that was, at least at the beginning, repeated in the within national borders, in national debates about the virus, but was something that, at least at the very beginning, was also portrayed as a reality of all mankind in its fight, let's say, against this virus. This is true from a strictly, I would say, medical and biological point of view. I mean, we have a virus which affects humankind and human bodies, some more, some less, according to their specific characteristic, individual, let's say, biological features. But as a matter of fact, it's something that affects us as men and women, as part of the humankind. So from this point of view, there can be no doubt that we have been confronted with something which was a threat to humans as such. But then we have this tendency at Linus to, as I think happens to every person in his or her own, let's say, psychological framework, affected by the discipline that one practices. We have this tendency to try to see things also from a strictly geopolitical point of view. And from this point of view, from this very point of view, the virus didn't really look that much like a common thing of humankind, as from the medical and biological perspective could be considered or seen. So let me just, which is, I think, is more useful and even pleasant for you, instead of seeing my face all the time, share this. I hope you can see them well. This is the cover. Some of these maps, and I apologize, they're in Italian because they were conceived and drawn and printed for an Italian audience. But I mean, they are not that, I think, difficult to interpret, or at least I will try to do my best to help in this. So first of all, the virus manifested itself in different stages, both from a geographical and from a chronological point of view, because it all started in China, in a specific region, we all know. Then, basically for work trips or work travels, it came to Europe. Apparently, it was first Bavaria, so it was first Germany, and then the north of Italy, which is, by the way, in a very close, especially industrial relationship with the south of Germany. So Italy, that was apparently the first, let's say, Western country to be heavily affected. And then the rest of Europe, and then the American, North American, then the rest of the American hemisphere, well, and then the other parts of the world. So this is not just something to say, this is not just a way to say the obvious, because the fact that from the point of view of the way that from a certain time which I think, I would say after the first month of pandemic, from a certain moment, we have witnessed the attempt of some countries more than others to try to exploit the virus for political purposes. For example, we saw at the very beginning, we witnessed China kind of bearing the brunt for being the country that didn't warn its own authorities, but then the rest of the world in time of this virus spreading. And so China was basically blamed for being a repressive and opaque country, which tried to put the kind of secrecy that characterizes its political environment over the need to curb the spread of the virus and to warn the rest of the world of this coming threat. That we witnessed the West, first of all Europe, and then the United States having troubles in coping with the spread of the virus, and then China with its face mask diplomacy try to take the upper hand and try to reverse this narrative and try to basically saying, okay, we were caught off guard. Maybe we made mistakes at the very beginning, but then look, we are the ones who are coping better than you because we are more disciplined, not just for cultural reasons, but also because we have a political system, okay, that renders us more disciplined and effective. Right? More effective in coping with all this. Now what's going on? Right? And then we saw all the things in between. So European countries, first of all, sealing themselves to try to keep the virus at bay and possibly out of their borders, and then trying to cope with the fact that the virus was within their borders and blaming, but also trying to help. I mean, all the chaos basically that ensued and was caused by the spread of this virus. So first of all, the virus is not something that, geopolitical speaking, was a sort of a neutral and common experience and common threat. It was, from a strictly, as I said, a medical point of view, but from a strictly political and strategic point of view, from a certain moment going on, and this moment came very early in the history of these pandemics, the virus also started to be treated and trying to be exploited for political aims, both internal, domestic, and external. And this is something that, I mean, it's obvious if you put it probably this way, as I'm putting it, but it's something that has consequences. And this consequences is what we tried to kind of highlight in this issue and in general in the way we try to think of the experience of the virus. So first of all, the virus came into being in countries which were and still are, to a very large extent, very differently equipped to deal with it. Rich countries and poor ones, country with a sprawling demography and countries with a less dynamic populations, and so with a less dense concentration of people in regions across their thing. We've been jammed, more or less. I don't know if you can just hear me anymore.
We're back, yes.
All right. So I guess you're being sabotaged by someone, I don't know who is. So let me try to go back to what I was trying to say. Right, there we go. Okay. And so what else? Yeah, and of course, countries with very different political frames and also systems of government. So you have for example, you have federal states and others in Europe. I could think of France, for example, where the powers of the states are very concentrated in the national government, which of course made a difference for good and for worse, of course. Of course, the way the countries created and distributed vaccines, sorry, were not the same. So we're not talking only about hoarding vaccines and try to, for at least at the very beginning, exclude some countries, or at least to privilege some domestic availability of the remedies instead of others, despite the international, also very often national authorities underline the fact that you cannot really win this fight if the world population is not fully or at least decently covered in terms of vaccination rates, because otherwise the virus keeps on spreading. Well, this is demography. But also, let me tell you, it was very interesting, and this is what was basically my contribution in this issue was based was revolving on or around was very interesting, seen from Europe, the way that the virus what the virus I wouldn't say did, but what the virus highlighted, if you want, and to the rest of the world, of the way America, the United States of America, functions or doesn't, and of the features of the American reality in these very historical moments. Let me just highlight 2 or 3 features from this point of view that, at least from my observation point, were very interesting to witness and to reflect upon. First of all, together with this, with the reframe, we're in this all together. We're all in this together. The other thing that very often we heard about the virus, at least in the first part of the pandemic, in the first year, is that nothing will be the same. That this virus was going to change everything, not only, or maybe not mainly, in the relations between countries, but also within countries. Because the virus was highlighting that there was a high and intolerable measure of inequality, of injustice, which was not only morally unjust, but was also kind of preventing the governments from confronting this threat in the best way possible. So I was, I did this about at the beginning of this year, because the issue is was, as I told you, was conceived and printed at the beginning of this year. So I tried to look at what the United States, from a social point of view, looked like after almost 2 years of virus. And the fact was that, from a point of view of wealth, what the virus did was basically very often increasing the differences between the richest and the poorest. So what you see here is the change, increase in wealth, which is distributed in the different segments of the population according to their pre-existing economic condition, pre-existing to the virus. I mean. So the billionaires saw their average wealth increasing by 70%. The corporate profits increased by 50%, and the salaries increased by less than 20%, while the prices, because of the deflationary effects of the virus, increased much less. Then I looked at, right? Then I looked at what the virus did to the racial divides in the United States. So what were the parts of the population that were most affected by the unemployment that was generated by the virus? Near is blacks, this is Hispanics, this is Asians, whites, and the rest. And well, you can see here that, of course, there are some parts of the population which are much more affected than the others. Then, and this is the last one, I looked at how the virus changed the rate of participation into the workforce between men and women with one child, un figlio, or two children, two or more. And you can see that the men that basically lost their jobs were less than 2%, while the women were more than 3%. And if you look at why, because women very often bore the brunt of the childcare that was due to the fact that the school were closed, and so the children were at home. If you look at the families with 2 children, the difference is even starker. And this is, I have to say, seen from outside, and especially seen from a country like Italy, where we know very well we have a very serious problem of low participation, female participation rate into the workforce, at least compared to other countries which fare better from this point of view. That was pretty something to say. And finally, I looked at how the rest of the world see, in part, as a consequence of the way the American democracy dealt, and society at large, and economic system dealt with the virus, how the rest of the world look at the American democracy as, and you can see the different colors here, a good example to follow for other countries, or those who consider it as a former good example, something that was a good example to follow but is not anymore, or those who say, which is the lightest of the green shown here, there has never been a good example. Now, this is particularly interesting to me from a strictly geopolitical point of view, because one of the things that you may be aware of, but seen from outside, it's something which is very true, because we are imbued of American culture from many points of view, is that the so-called soft power, which, by the way, is nothing less than the ability to convince others that you're a positive force, you're a good force, and so convince the others to do what is even best for you without having to do it, let's say, in a coercive way, which is what, for instance, for example, Russia lacks. And this is why Russia repeatedly in its history has to wage wars to try to keep its neighbors close to her. This is something which is very important. This is something which is usually associated with the United States. So this graph here is at least, I think, very telling, because it shows us that for many populations around the world, even of countries, as you can see here, that are very closely associated with the United States from a economic, a cultural, a touristic, a military or strategic point of view, for many of them, democracy, which is, by the way, seen in a very often in a less enthusiastic way, also when referred to their own systems and their own country, but the American democracy, which should be the standard and has been the standard for many years, for many decades, at least from the end of the Second War, is not that city upon a hill anymore as it used to be and used to be perceived and looked at up until a few years ago. Now, all this brings me to look at the virus and its psychological effects in a very, let's say, complex and nuanced way. Because this means that something which, as a matter of fact, is a common reality of our species, let's say a medical threat that concerns us all more or less in the same way, is perceived in different ways, is used in different ways, and also has effects within societies, but also between societies, that ultimately don't level the international and domestic realities as this common threat could supposed to do, at least when seeing it, when we see it from a strictly biological and medical perspective. But on the other hand, it becomes a tool. It becomes affected by the way we kind of live it, experience it. And so ultimately it becomes something which is no less artifact than many other tools than our political environments use for domestic and external purposes. In other words, we as a species and as societies, and in our also geopolitical actions, are very good at the culturalized things. I mean, at taking realities and use them in a way which deny them of their commonalities, even if they are self-evident, like a medical threat. So there is, at the end of the day, a common feature, a common reality to this pandemic. But there is also a very strong, let's say, I would dare to say, nationalization in its uses and its perceptions. And this is what, at the end of the day, denies the two assumptions that we started with, that I started with in this brief speech, and that we started with at the beginning of the pandemics, that we are all in this together, and that nothing will be the same after the virus. At the end of the day, we haven't been in this together as we were supposed to be at the beginning, both in a national realm and in the international, on an international stage. And very often the virus reinforced realities that it found instead of leveling them and changing them in a way that made our world unrecognizable. Well, that's it. Thank you very much for your attention, and sorry for the interruption, which, by the way, was not my fault.
Thank you so much, Fabrizio, for a number of already stimulating aspects you touched upon. And I think that we may turn to Giorgio and then to collect some few other questions, included mine, just at the end of Giorgio's talk. Just if there's any other that wants to jump in right now, you can. We didn't set up just strictly a space for Q&A, could even be now. Otherwise, we can turn to the second speaker and then we can have a general discussion afterwards. Yeah, okay, we can turn to Giorgio.
Okay. First of all, Rosa, thank you for your kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and join this such an interesting discussion. Because, of course, as Fabrizio underlined, it's crucial to understand the differences in the great powers' geopolitical postures, especially between the two most important powers in the world, namely the United States and China. China is a very important case. We have to study the Chinese case in geopolitical and psychological terms, because today, in these days, China is still struggling with the COVID-19, and it has a very different kind of strategy in order to tackle the COVID-19. It's called the Zero COVID strategy, which means that Beijing basically wants to eliminate any kind of, it wants to eliminate the epidemic, wants to defeat it completely. But anyway, after 2 years, at least, China is still struggling with the epidemic. So, and especially it is affecting the most important geopolitical hubs in China. So Beijing has a different strategy compared to strategies applied in Europe and the United States and so on, because it's a very rigid strategy. For example, now Shanghai, which is one of the most important cities in China, is under lockdown. Regular community testing programs are carried both in Shanghai and in other cities. In Shanghai, we have about 27,000 coronavirus cases, which is pretty high compared to the cases published at least in 2020. But anyway, it's not a huge number if we think that right now in Shanghai live about 25 million people. So it's not a bigger issue, at least from our perspective, in terms of epidemic problem. But the reason why China, Beijing, now is trying to completely defeat the COVID-19 goes beyond the epidemic situation. It is connected with the geopolitical targets that China has right now, and it deals with Chinese targets from now to 2049, which is the year in which China wants to, or at least until China wants to succeed in becoming a superpower in terms of military, economics, and so on. So in order to succeed, in order to become a superpower, and in order to compete, really compete with the United States in economics, in soft power and military, Beijing has, first of all, must control its population, must, let's say, preserve the stability inside the People's Republic of China. In order to preserve the stability, first of all, must to ensure, to guarantee to the population a better quality of life. And the COVID-19 is considered a threat in this context, because is threatening not only the China in terms of health, but also in terms of quality of living and in terms of economy, because if COVID-19 still affect the population, there is the risk that in the next year also the economic will be affected and can also let's say that the Chinese GDP from now and in next years can be affected by the epidemic situation. So China is facing huge challenges in terms of geopolitical struggle with the United States, and has to find a solution in order to prevent any kind of discontent, any kind of dissatisfaction inside the country. So this is the first thing, I think. This is the first reason why we can consider China a different case, very different from the United States or other European countries. I would like to share with you a map in order to better describe geopolitical situation in China. Okay, here it is. So right now, China is trying to achieve two targets. First of all, preserve the stability inside. So Beijing and Xi Jinping are trying to preserve the stability inside China. The first measure in this context is, of course, the adoption of rigid measures to prevent the increase of COVID-19 infections, especially in the most important cities of the country. So Shanghai is a very important case, because is probably the richest city in the country, is a financial hub, is the most important logistic hub of the PRC. Is located on the Chinese coast, and so it is also well connected with the rest of the world. Besides, is also a geopolitical hub, because we can say that it is a kind of headquarter of affection inside the Chinese Communist Party, rival to the President Xi Jinping. It is called the Shanghai Gang, which is led by the former Chinese President Jiang Zemin. And this Shanghai Gang still has a role in the Chinese inner struggles inside the Chinese Communist Party. So today it is a very important task for Beijing, succeeding in defeating the COVID-19 in Shanghai, also because Beijing doesn't want that the COVID-19 become a sort of excuse in order to protest against the Chinese president, especially now, because next autumn in Beijing will take place the next National Congress, and it will define the new leadership, Chinese new leadership, and probably it will confirm Xi Jinping as the Chinese leader after 2022. So Xi Jinping doesn't want that the Shanghai Gang uses the COVID-19 as a leverage, as a tool against the government. The second measure that Beijing is adopting in order to manage the COVID-19 epidemic is the severe punishment of local politicians, where cases of mismanagement emerge. Last year, 600,000 officials were punished for disciplinary violations. And basically, Xi Jinping wants to show that the top, the leadership, is rigid, inflexible against the failures of the officials who are in contact with the population. And besides, want to show that internal reshuffles are possible even in the absence of a democratic electoral system. It is a way in order to prevent dissatisfaction inside the country. But as a matter of fact, also in these days, we are realizing that Chinese population is dissatisfied and is protesting against the so-called zero COVID strategy, especially in Shanghai. But anyway, Xi Jinping wants to deliver a message also to the officials. They have to do anything in their power in order to prevent the spreading of the COVID-19. And this message is linked to the third measure that Xi Jinping is implementing, aimed at, so the third measure is, as a matter of fact, fight the rival factions, so the Shanghai Gang. So in the last 2 years, Xi Jinping used the COVID-19 as an excuse in order to defeat the rivals inside the Chinese Communist Party. If you take a look at the map, for example, when the COVID-19 spread in Wuhan, Xi Jinping took the chance to select some of its let's say members, some of the Chinese Communist Party members who belonged to his faction. He decided to locate them in Wuhan, in Hong Kong, and for example in Chongqing. So using the pretext, the excuse of the COVID-19 epidemic. Wuhan is a very important city in China, not just because of the epidemic. Wuhan is at the crossroads, between the route which connects today Beijing to Hong Kong, and at the same time is located along the Yangtze River, which is the most important river in China because it connects the Chinese coast with the inner regions. So the richest part of China, the coast, and the inner regions, so the poorer part of the country. So Wuhan has a strategic position, and Xi Jinping took the chance to better control Wuhan. After that, he used the same strategy in Hong Kong, And in the last 2 years, he introduced the national security law in Hong Kong in order to better control the former British colony, which still wants to be different from the rest of the country. We know that Hong Kong is a special administrative region with characterized by much more freedom in terms of economics, politics, and society. But in the last, at least in the last 2 years, the so-called one country, two system policy, which regulates the relation between Beijing and Hong Kong, is fading away, as a matter of fact. So Hong Kong is less free than 20 years ago. And so it is another important case in study. And we have also to take into account that Hong Kong is a very important geopolitical hub in China, not just because it's a financial hub, but also because it is a kind of bridge. It was at least a bridge between China and the rest of the world, not just in the economic terms, but also in terms of culture and politics. So we can say that Xi Jinping took the chance to better control the country, but as a matter of fact, after 2 years, he is still struggling in order to prevent the spreading of the COVID-19 and in preventing the possibility of dissatisfaction inside the country. At the same time, Beijing is trying to turn the COVID-19 into an opportunity abroad. So, as Fabrizio said before, China took the chance to put into force the so-called face mask diplomacy in order to expand its influence abroad in Western countries, but also I would say, and especially I would say in Africa, in Latin America, and so on, because right now China needs to improve its soft power abroad. It needs to show to the rest of the world that it's a much more mature country, capable of competing with the United States, also in terms of soft power. Anyway, it is not succeeding in doing it. First of all, because there is a lack of transparency when we talk about how the COVID-19 spread the first time in Wuhan. Second, the face mask diplomacy helped China to succeed in improving its soft power in Africa or in Latin America, where there are countries that basically need Chinese investments in order to grow and to build infrastructure and so on. But for example, in Western countries, the face mask diplomacy failed after several months because European countries, for example, many European countries, for example, decided to have a much more rigid stance, a rigid posture against China on other issues. For example, human rights, and especially, I would say, Chinese penetration, Chinese influence in technological and economic sectors in the European countries. And Italy is an example. In the last 2 years, Rome took distance from Beijing in technological sector, also because Washington kindly suggested to Rome to take distance from Beijing after the Italian government decided in 2019 to sign the so-called Memorandum of Understanding on the Belt and Road Initiative, which is, as you probably know, an infrastructural project, but also a geopolitical project. Is basically the tool that China is using in order to expand its influence abroad in terms of geopolitics. So, in conclusion, China, Beijing, the Chinese government, succeed in better control the most important geopolitical hubs inside the country, but at the same time failed to promote its soft power, not just in the European countries, but I would add also Taiwan. And Taiwan is very important because Beijing wants to control of Taiwan before 2049. So this is a relevant part of the so-called China dream, control Taiwan in the next 20 years. But right now, Taiwanese population doesn't want to accept the unification with the Chinese mainland. And because Taiwanese population wants to preserve its own political system and shape a new kind of identity, cultural identity. One of the reasons why Taiwanese population wants to do it is because the Chinese soft power failed to deliver a good image, a better image of the China of the China of the future. So this is very important because Taiwanese population is made by the so-called Han ethnic group as a large majority, which is the same ethnic majority in the People's Republic of China. And the PRC and Taiwan share a lot in terms of culture and history. But China is failing to deliver a good image of itself to Taiwan in those days, and also because the way it is managing the COVID-19 epidemic and the way it's managing Hong Kong, which had once a similar position to Taiwan in some sense. So I think that the way China is facing the COVID-19, both domestic and abroad in the country and abroad, is a clear example of how a very different country can face in a very bad way the epidemic COVID-19. Sorry. Thank you.
All right. So thank you very much, Giorgio, for the other insights that you brought into our roundtable today from the point of view of the Chinese context and how it used and has been going through the same COVID-19 phenomenon that we've been discussing so far, that interestingly you both name epidemic and not pandemic due to your theoretical and geopolitical position, which is already something interesting to discuss. I do encourage all participants just to jump into the Q&A session, and you may also, I guess I all know people here, so we're not gonna run any risk of letting someone with the video on, so you can also turn on your video if you want to have a direct contact, direct question, or you may type any question in the chat. In the meantime, all right, So in the meantime, I may start just breaking the ice with few thoughts and also few questions that I would like to share with all of you and to with our speakers as well. Because just starting with what Fabrizio Maronta said at the very beginning and at the very end of his talk, he was stressing how there were two leitmotifs throughout this COVID-19 worldwide phenomenon, which was nothing will be the same afterwards. So COVID-19 was kind of framed as an apocalyptic phenomenon, which was supposed to totally reverse the order of different powers all over the world, first of all. And then he discussed how actually this hasn't been the case in terms of the very structure of worldwide powers. And also, another very important leitmotif of this pandemic, which has been, we are all in the same situation. And he interestingly analyzed different, according to different parameters, for instance, how it wasn't the case, for instance, in the United States, in terms of race, class, and gender differences, already in internal context, not merely in international context. But I would like just to bring here some psychological assumptions that I think that may be emerging from this talk today and that we might further elaborate on, which is, it seems to me that COVID-19 seen from a geopolitical point of view, as we all listen right now so far, has been disrupting the in-group, out-group social psychology dimensions. So which is exactly my in-group and which is exactly my out-group, which is a fundamental socio-cognitive dimension in psychology in terms of how can I recognize the threat to myself and how can I recognize my group. So what I would like maybe Fabrizio and also Giorgio and all the others to reflect upon is that what you said, Fabrizio, ultimately, that COVID-19 in the middle of this nature culture debate, because that is what we are talking about today. We're not merely approaching COVID-19 as a biological phenomenon. We have been listening to a number of data, a number of arguments that were just highlighting how a biological phenomenon is never, and has definitely not been this case with COVID-19, never been only a strict clinical symptoms, so neither a clinical symptom nor a simple social phenomenon. So that's where I see psychology and geopolitics in dialogue. And in their very interesting issue called The Other Virus that was published, of course, in Italian at the very beginning of this year, what I found very interesting was also this idea of waving and interconnecting the materiality and immateriality. It's very fascinating and also urgent question, the one related to the biological, so the organic basis of the virus, together with its immaterial effects, and how they do constitute a reality in terms of geopolitics, in terms of the reframing of our social interaction. So this kind of balance or unbalance between materiality of deaths, of people that have been going through very embodied phenomena, is counterbalanced with the immateriality of something that maybe we cannot just witness right now, but we can just only hypothesize for the future.
If I can tell you something about this,
Sure.
I think that there are 2 points that are interesting to stress. Well, 2 examples or 2 aspects of what you're saying, especially in terms of out-group and in-group, which are interesting to talk about, to think about. First is the, as you very well stressed, one of my points was that coronavirus started, as many things in our lives, as a medical or, let's say, biological fact, and then it turned, or it became, at least partially, a cultural thing, because everything, or almost everything, that concerns our species before or later becomes, sooner or later becomes also a culturally labeled, or if you want, defined. There has been a lot of talk in Europe and within Europe, European, let's say, medias and to a certain extent public opinions, about the way different European countries have managed to cope with the virus. Some has done better, some worse. 2 things that are, I think, worth noting here is that you may know that between European countries and societies, there are a lot of stereotypes that come from our long history that for the most part has not been a very easy one. We've been fighting a lot of wars among each other. And of course, there's a sort of legacy with it, which is a very difficult one. So don't be fooled by the reality of the European Union, which is, of course, an institutional thing. We also even share a currency, which is the euro. Not all of us, but lots of countries which are part of the European Union. But then every time a crisis erupts, which can be migrants, coming in big numbers to Europe because of the war nearby. The last one before Ukraine was Syria, or it can be some financial and economic issues like the crisis that erupted, by the way, in the United States, and then its way reached our shores in 2009, 2010. Every time our European Union is put under stress, reciprocal stereotypes tend to reemerge. And the coronavirus was no exception. So basically, we saw a sort of debate arising from the medical fact of some countries pointing finger to others being not enough disciplined to cope with the virus, and others saying, oh, okay, but maybe you're being mean to yourself and to others in the way you cope with the virus. And I'm saying this because one of the latest piece of news I read was yesterday, I think. It was a study that came out of a commission that was set up in Sweden, which is a very different country from Italy from all aspects, not least the cultural one, about the way the Swedes have been coping with the virus. So we've had in Italy a very big debate from the very beginning, because we were one of the first countries to lock down. And so you may have seen images on TV of Italian chanting the national anthem and waving Italian flags, or exchanging jokes and music from balconies and so on. That was so Italian, so folkloristic seen from outside. And then we had this study from the Swedish Commission about the coronavirus that was published yesterday, I think. and it was very much published, it was very much advertised in the media, because the conclusion of this commission was that the Swedes, which by the way are as humans as we Italian and you Americans are, so are not different, not a different kind of species from the rest of us, allegedly, at least this is what their experts say, have been willingly letting elderly take the virus and die if that was the case, and let children take the virus and spread it in order to reach mass immunity sooner than others. So it doesn't mean that we are very nice because we're Italian, and they are very cold people because they're up there in the north of Europe. They're Scandinavian, they're Swedes. The Swedes are, you know, less humane than we are. This is not the point. The point is the very same virus, and the difference that culturally are ingrained in the ways that different countries cope with it. This is fascinating, but also very divisive at the very same time. The other thing is about the in-group and out-group you were saying before. I think that as far as Europe, this is something that is concerned with Europe now. Specifically, one of the things that may be forcing our society to to reach a newfound unity, and so reversing some of the divisive effects that were brought by the virus between social classes, the worst and the less affected by the, economically speaking, by the virus, or the young and the less young ones, because the youngest suffered especially the isolation, while the elderly also the fear of the virus itself. Well, one of the things that are kind of maybe forcing us to reshape our national or social discourse and our way to interact within each other in the wake of the virus is the war in Ukraine, because the war is a very unifying mechanism that when you feel threatened, you tend to roll about the flag, as you said, in the United States. And this is something that is not our specific case, because we're not directly involved in the war. We're not Ukraine, fortunately. But this is a threat which is kind of looming. So I'm very curious and eager to see the medium-term effect of the war on our collective European psychologists, and the way this effect interacts and mingles with the effect of the coronavirus. I wouldn't be too surprised to find that this threat, which is a classical one, by the way, because war is something which is much more known to us, which is much more ingrained in our, at least European memories, than the pandemics, the last one being the Spanish flu, which is very much behind us. I wouldn't be surprised, I would say, if this ends up reshaping, in a way, our memory of the virus, our collective memory of the virus, and the divisions that the virus somehow brought in our societies. But this is something that we will have to wait at least probably some month or even years to see. But just to quote another element that can come upon the other one to influence and to reshape once again the public psychologists affected by the virus.
Thank you, thank you, thank you very much, Fabrizio, to address this point that I was really interested to. And I would like just to actually ask and directing this question that came from the audience. And actually, one student, one of my students, just to Giorgio, and maybe just connecting this question to the Chinese context, that will be very interesting to share. So do you think that COVID-19 has mentally and physically affected different cultures the same way? And actually, I would like just to complement this question, because I've heard in one of your video analysis, Giorgio, talking about the body resistance among the youth, in the Chinese youth. You describe some embodied techniques through which they are currently making a sort of public resistance. So I would like just to, if you can just address both aspects. So if COVID-19 has affected mentally and physically in a different way, different cultures, or in the same way, and the embodied resistance among youth Chinese. Thank you.
Thank you. No, it's a very interesting question, because yes, I think that COVID-19 is affecting countries in different ways, also in this context. I mean, China, the Chinese younger population is, I would not say crisis, but they are facing a peculiar moment in Chinese history, because the younger population, I mean, the younger generations, I mean, the government, the Chinese government asks the younger generations to lead China in to lead China in achieving its goals. So in order to become a superpower, a great power, China must have let's say strong, smart, and brave younger generations. So this kind of request put pressure on the Chinese. So they must take the degree very quickly. They must lead the country in terms of economic growth and so on. So you mentioned the way the Chinese are resisting to this kind of pressure. In Chinese, it's called tamping, which means stay on the bed and essentially doing nothing. Is a passive way of answering the pressure coming from the Chinese government. By the way, the Chinese Communist Party stated some months ago that Chinese males lack, they are not, let's say, there is a lack of virility among the Chinese males. So the Chinese government decided to improve the gym classes at the high schools in order, and also paramilitary program in the high schools in order to improve the masculinity of the Chinese population, because Beijing knows very well that in order to become a great power, the population must have some kind of degree of the population must be ready to fight a war, And in order to fight a war, Beijing states, the male population must be violent in some way or another. So Beijing is answering to this lack of masculinity in this way, improving the gym classes and paramilitary activities, because wants to deliver also to the population a clear message that China has to be ready to fight wars, eventually against the United States and against Taiwan, because the narrative, Chinese narrative, is all about US-China competition and the necessity to take control of Taiwan as a strategic target. So this is a connection between the psychological situation of the population and the geopolitical targets in China.
Thank you very much. So a few other questions are coming. Very, very nice. Okay, so I'm gonna just read loud this question for both of you. So how has COVID-19 affected intimacy and relationships differently throughout different cultures, in your opinion? Somehow already Giorgio has kind of addressed this issue by saying that actually masculinity that is still felt as a kind of personal characteristic, as a kind of personal feature, is actually a milestone to be controlled by governments. And actually it is monitored and it is shaped in terms of government programs and schedules, class schools programs, etc. So I think that we cannot just touch everything about China so far, but I'm sure that Giorgio might have added something on the of the only child policies in China, and which have been their effects, and also which might be the current effect on this kind of policy throughout the COVID-19, but we cannot touch upon everything on this. I guess somehow he went through these topics, and we have a couple of other questions, so I really want to read them for you. So there's Kennedy Holmes, who says, in my opinion, I feel like the Asian community has been impacted heavily mentally and physically. For example, former President Donald Trump's comments throughout COVID-19 calling to the Kung flu disease. Became of this, I've seen interviews of many Asian Americans experiencing hate crimes in public and being blamed for the global outbreak of the virus. So yeah, the different impact that the Asians were going through in the United States has been a major issue in the previous months.
But I can tell you that there has been also we have numerous Chinese immigration in Israel. I don't think there is a wealthy country that doesn't have one. And this is something that has been has subdued to a certain extent now, also because we have other things in Ukraine and so on. But as a matter of fact, there has been I wouldn't say harassment. I wouldn't go to that far to describe it, but a sense of unease and diffidence. Suspect, lack of trust vis-a-vis the Chinese living in Italy. Many of them are what we call second generation, because we use it in a different way. We call second generation those who were born in Italy from non-Italian parents. By the way, those who were born here. And this is something that has reinforced, talking about stereotypes, some stereotypes that people usually have towards, place here, people of Asian descent, but more than of Asian descent, I would say the first-generation immigrants, because they, at least here in Italy, and talking about the Chinese in particular, they tend to stay on their own. Unlike other ethnicities coming from abroad and who are here in Italy, they tend to be quite sealed up groups that don't really mingle with each other. Many of them, for example, talking to professors of high school lately, many of them, for example, don't want their children, especially if they're girls, to continue studying, to go to university after high school because they want, after college, to go to college after high school because they want to work in their shops and so on. So this is something that is, and the COVID has been feeding this kind of suspicious attitude, which is, by the way, something that I have to tell you, in my personal perception, has been subduing, not just because of other distractions like Ukraine, but also because COVID has become part of our realities. And I mean, it's not something that has been labeled as a Chinese thing. Also, we didn't have, let's say, institutional inputs in Italy, maybe unlike in other countries, to try to depict the flu as a Chinese one. Well, but maybe the virus. The fact that the virus came from China, this is something that, geopolitically speaking, really changed also the perception of the place China occupies right now in our world. Because if you think of the difference between the SARS, SARS, I mean, the corona, it was a coronavirus anyway, it manifested in China, erupted in China some 20 years ago, and COVID, I mean, biologically speaking, if we want to talk about the virus as a biological thing, which is, by the way, discussed, I mean, from a medical point of view, we're talking about two very similar viruses. I mean, what made SARS a very regional thing? We didn't have a memory of that. And so an epidemic that stayed as such. And what turned COVID-19 in a pandemic, I mean, a virus that was so quickly spread out and exported from China to the rest of the world, was the fact that China, today's China, compared with China of 20 years ago, is very much more interconnected and interdependent with the rest of the world. So this is something that testifies objectively of the importance that China has in our, not just in our economic real world economics, but also world economy, but also in the world at large. So this is, if you want, we can take the coronavirus as a sort of measure of the rise that China has been spectacularly performing in the last 20 years.
And if I may,
lately, because it's a rise that began earlier. Sure.
If I may add, the COVID-19 spread quickly after the promotion of the Belt and Road Initiative, which was the project that China proposed in order to become a great power, in order to deliver a better image of itself abroad, stating that the Belt and Road Initiative is made by China, but open to the rest of the world. And after that, the COVID-19 seriously damaged Chinese image. So in this way, it affected in the very bad way Chinese targets abroad, and the COVID-19 become part of US-China competition in terms of propaganda and struggles and so on, together with other issues. So the military issue, military competition, the technological presence of companies like Huawei, ZTE in other countries, and so on. some year ago, we talked a lot about Chinese presence in 5G infrastructures here in Italy. But after that, we more or less forgot it. And now we are focused on other issues. But although we discussed a lot about the 5G, the Chinese technologies in the 5G sector, now we have companies using the 5G in Italy, but is a 5G produced and developed by Chinese companies. So we forgot the issue and started to talk about something else.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Giorgio. I really would like just to ask another question. The time is running out, but maybe we have time for a last question. So I was curious, the status Fabrizio mentioned earlier with how COVID affected work and school with moms becoming stay-at-home.
Yeah.
Are the stats similar within the healthcare setting? How has COVID affected the trust of people toward medical professionals?
Oh, well, I can talk about Italy because I don't know about the US, but I mean, virologists has been, I mean, have been saturating TV channels and the public debate to the extent that people stop to listen to them anymore. And this, well, I think that this tells a lot, by the way, about our cultural, the Germans call it Zeitgeist, which is translated is the way to look, is the sense that societies have of their time, of their world in the time they live. Because I think that one of the problems, not only in Italy, but in general, the public opinions had with the medical class at large, is that we expected, we have developed such a high set of expectations towards science, because we live in you know, hyper technological and scientific times, that we expected medicine and doctors to you know, take us out of this mess, as well as something, you know, repairs our you know, laptop or smartphone if the screen is broken. I mean, like this. Apart of that, you know, every NH serious doctor will tell you that medicine is not a perfect exact discipline, is an applied one. So I mean, you have to do with human body and human psyche, by the way, which is not, which is very much still, which is still very much unknown, and so much to discover, and so we still proceed in a sort of tentative way very often, even as much as our biological functions are concerned. And then viruses are very elusive creatures, which fit even more in this frame. But apart from that, I think that we should rethink a little bit, also in psychological terms, but I would say more large in cultural ones, our relations and our expectations vis-a-vis science. And I'm saying this also as a geopolitical analyst, because one of the things that pushed us, one of the consideration, one of the thought that pushed us to do such a to conceive such a volume like the one we're discussing now, the issue of the limits we're discussing now, and in general, all others that deal with things that are not directly usually ascribed by people to the geostrategic analysis, is that very often, even in the so-called social sciences, which is a definition that could sound a little bit like a paradox somehow, because everything which is social as an element of unpredictability that is not that scientifically definable in a very exact manner, is the assumption that very often we find that even in the strategic analysis and strategic thinking, very often people tend to do it, to do strategy, forgetting that you're talking at the very end of the day of something that has to relate to humans. Because what is strategy? Strategy is basically the way to predict what the other will do in order to prevent others' action that might harm you or affect you in a way that you don't want to be affected. So we should, I think, bring a measure of humanity and a measure of, let's say, human thought in our cultural mindset, which has been lately shaped, I think, understandably, but maybe a little bit too much, by technological considerations and technological attitudes, which of course reflect the times we live in, which is a time of a technology which is almighty to a certain extent. But at the very end of the day, we are humans, and technology should be a means, not an end in itself. Because if we consider it an end in itself, we end up denying our very nature. And this brings us not only to deny ourselves, but also to make terrible mistakes. And I think the way we asked medicine and the medical professionals to make the coronavirus disappear, and all the expectations that we put into this, and all the frustration that came out of noticing that that was not the case, it was not so quick and a radical and let's say victory, the one that we could achieve vis-a-vis the coronavirus. This is something that I think speaks loudly and volumes about this sort of mismatch or sort of short circuit in our cultural, let's say, in our cultures nowadays.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, Fabrizio. So many interesting insights that we cannot actually elaborate more on. For instance, this volume called The Other Virus is also really fascinating when it touches upon different anti-vaccination movements, starting from Italy, but I would also connect it to similar ones here in the US, and especially how interesting is that this kind of phenomenon is in between spirituality and materiality, and that is growing actually also in very wealthy and rich places. So if you take Trentino Alto Adige, which is a kind of wealth space and region in Italy, and you compare it also to other regions in the United States, there's some sort of quite similar interesting interconnection among the two, which we cannot just deepen right now, but that will be very interesting to do so in the future. So there's a very last one. I don't know if you wanna address it or not. You are running out of.
I personally leave it to Giorgio.
Okay.
The last word, and also 5 minutes I have to go because I have another engagement. But
yeah. Okay. So I'll just read it aloud, and then what we can do is just to give a kind of synthetical answer. Maybe Giorgio will. And then we're going just to say goodbye to thank you, everybody. So can you just speak a bit about historically how governments and politicians have taken advantage of viruses, sicknesses to control, appropriate, direct, colonize? And actually, we already touched upon this a little bit. Giorgio did it with the Chinese example, and creating narratives that attempts to influence or convince others to join an outside agenda. Convincing others to join an outside agenda. Yeah, maybe maybe Giorgio also already focused on this when he was talking about the Belt and Road Initiative and how it has been a kind of Chinese government inspired initiative that went through a different pathway in Europe after the COVID-19 has spread out all over the world. So somehow we touch upon all these topics. But by the way, we are recording the webinar, so it will be available, and all of you will have more time to just to listen to it more and looking into it more closely.
Yeah, I may add just one thing to what I said before about the Beijing purposes in applying the so-called zero COVID strategy in China. I think that that Beijing is also testing how Chinese population can resist to a wartime situation, because the zero COVID strategy is a very rigid strategy, as I said before. So in a way, the Chinese government is testing the resilience of the population to a challenge, to a period of sufferance, in order to understand if the population will be ready to face other similar period, namely in the wartime period itself. What would be the reaction of the population, for example, if the government decides to declare war to Taiwan? What may happen in that situation? So it is a way of experimenting. It's way to test. It is a way to test the reaction of the population. So it is connected to the question made.
Thank you very much, Fabrizio, Maronta, and Giorgio Cuscito for.
Thank you, Rossella, and thank you to all your students and colleagues for
faculty
patiently listen to us.
Yeah, it was
too kind of you.
Yeah, it was very interesting experiment to make in dialogue and connection, psychology and geopolitics, and hope all of you enjoy the meeting. And on behalf of the psychology program and the Department of Anthropology, Psychology and Sociology at the University of West Georgia, I wanna just wish you to enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you once again to join us.
Thank you very much indeed. Have a good day. Ciao, Giorgio.